Let's bring David Murrin into this conversation. He's joined us on the end of the desk. David is the CIO of Emergent. That's a hedge fund that's been investing in the emerging world for some time. David, good to see you back here. And for the purpose of the conversation, we should point out not only that you have more facial hair than last time I saw you, which obviously is a new thing going on here in terms of the look, but David has just written a book called Breaking the Code of History, a Map for the Future. So if we've been here before, David, as I think you argue, what goes on after this?
Well, we've been here before, as in the world, the country, which continent. I think to understand some of the big changes we're going through, sometimes long-term history impacts the now, and we're in it. Like a schism, like two tectonic plates that suddenly shift after 100 years of energy building up. And that's really the end of a Western Christian empire. It's bigger than the British Empire, the American Empire. It's the sum of all the Christian empires for nearly 900 years. And America is the last one. And when the last one changes and declines, which it's in, and it'll be very rapid, it's the end of a whole system. And at the same time, the system that rises challenges far quicker as it moves into the vacuum created by the old system. And that's the East. So we all know there's going to be a change. The surprise will be the rate of that change. And we view the new administration in America as New Hope. Unfortunately, if you look at historical precedents of underclass and the mechanisms of an underclass actually becoming to the fore demographically, it is not New Hope. It's the beginning of the end. And we're seeing that very quickly take place.
Okay, I have to put my boxing gloves on here and defend that I just don't see it. For a couple of reasons. One, I think it's a very bad moment in history to be betting against the United States, because if there's one thing the U.S. economy has proved over and over is its ability to recover from trauma is unmatched. And so I think that it's too early to make the bet that this is the end of history for the U.S., number one. Number two,
I didn't say the end of history.
Well,
I just said the decline of relative power. That's very different.
Well, then that's the second point.
But you've already received it. I mean, did you manage to keep the North Koreans from building nuclear weapons? Are you successfully projecting power in Iran? You are losing power in front of you. And just like the British Empire, you're all in denial.
Understood. But what I don't see as well is China filling the vacuum, both in terms of economic drivers, but also political, because Chinese leadership is very nervous about taking a leadership role on many of these kinds of controversial issues, and their policy is driven by their own national interest. It's not about being, a global leader. So I understand, and I just think we've got to be careful too about assumptions. Demographics in the East are not great. It's not as though that's a one-way bet. Okay. So
you've thrown a lot of things my way with your boxing gloves, so I'm going to try and remember what you said. First of all empires as they decline underestimate the challengers, because they believe they're upstarts. They call them barbarians in their head. To think of the Chinese as barbarians is a complete mistake. They're complex, sophisticated. They've been around in many cycles of empire in their same domain. Their sophisticated strategy has outwitted us in terms of North Korea, Iran. They're running ring round us already. And we still don't identify them, even in Afghanistan, the mechanisms of funding that take place through proxies. That's the first thing. Underestimate is a big mistake. The second is that if you look at any economic power, none of them in history have ever failed to militarize, especially when they have trading systems. And if you look at the rise of the Chinese Navy and the arms race taking place in the East, their goal is to develop a green water navy and then a blue water navy. It's just like the Washington Treaty that took place in the 30s. So although we look at it and we think it's not going to happen quickly, these things happen far faster than we realize. And there is nothing which you've explained to me in terms of the durability. The Romans were durable until they collapsed. Lots of empires were durable until that moment they overextended.
There are a lot of things to believe, actually, on both arguments. But what are the implications of this? I mean, I think there's no doubt that the U.S. is the largest economy in the world, and it remains the case. I mean, and this is an incredibly important economy. But there are other important economies, and increasingly the East is becoming increasingly important, and we need to recognize that. But what are the implications of history repeating itself from your standpoint, David?
Well, there are a couple of things. I think the refusal of Obama to commit to the missile defense system in Poland was a terrible sign to the adversaries of America. They saw it as weakness. And in fact, if you look at Chinese policy since and articulation, it's been far more aggressive and expansive. So the moment that the incumbent shows its inability to project power and use the power it has, the challengers move forward very quickly. And that's exactly what we're seeing in a short space of time. And although in demography, what concerns me about China, although the peak is 2025, that's the peak of probably the commodity commodity cycle. So you've got a conflict driven by commodities and resources, and you have the peak of the demographics, and more importantly, you have an awful lot more males in China than you do females. And testosterone in societies as a relationship means you have more risk capital. You're more prepared to risk your people in conflict.
But the one-child rule is also an issue here?
No, it isn't. It's interesting about it. It's an issue because at 2025 they run over the peak. It's what they do before 2025 we should worry about. We've got to get through that point. And at the moment they have a mass of extra males. They have 56% of their society is male. And a normal society is 51. That's 5% of extra risk capital. And what that means is they're far more risk-orientated than actually a society in the West.
I like this idea that testosterone equals risk capital, but
that is an interesting point that you're making. I did not think that either. That's very much a generalization, men versus women in terms of risk capital.
That's not a sexist comment. What it is if you look at conflict and the ability to risk your males in conflict, generically in history, that's what I'm referring to. Because historically, that's how we've been coded to use male risk capital.
But I have to say, I do agree. When the U.S. doesn't project its authority, definitely there are consequences. But the American public is showing in its polls that it's voting against that stance by the current government. But the bigger issue is the competition for control over space, cyberspace, and the high seas between the U.S. and China. And that is an area I think markets are not paying enough attention to. They are not understanding that this is the story behind the Google dispute. This is the story behind the anti-satellite tests that China and the U.S. keep holding. And these strategic security issues will matter when it comes to simple questions like, will China continue funding U.S. treasuries? Maybe not.
Well, you know, you're right about those key points. So one of the key balances is cyber conflict is about how you absorb the knowledge of the person that's invested so much to get it.
Absolutely.
And so what they've done is narrowed the technology gap very quickly. And the big shock is we don't realize it, but they're going to start to innovate. And the expansion to empire phase is very innovative. And the shock is that China will out-innovate us. And we've been historically the innovators.
I agree with you, because I think right now China doesn't necessarily only want to be the producer of products to the world. They want to innovate and they want to design.
They are innovating.
And that is going to be a major threat to the United States.
It is, and if you look at the number of patents they produce, it's a higher ratio than anyone else. You look at even the use of cyber war to destroy the advantages of network-centric warfare that we use in the West. They've worked out where our weaknesses are, and they're working very, very hard to close those gaps.
David, you're going to hang around for a little bit longer.
If you want me.
We can have round two when we come back. David Murrin, CIO and Senior Partner at Emergent Asset Management and the author of Breaking the Code of History, A Map for the Future.